to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I'm Magnus Linklater, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel discussion on a very key issue, both for business and for heritage and for modern Scotland. And the title is How Heritage Can Help Win Business for Scotland. And we have assembled a very, very distinguished and expert panel, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. Can I just say one thing, that this is all going to be recorded, and so if anybody has a strong objection to that, they should leave now. But if they don't, realize that everything you say may be taken down and could well be used in evidence at some stage in the future. On my far right, Azeem Ibrahim is an entrepreneur and an internationalist in the great Scottish tradition. He's a research fellow at Harvard and a world fellow at Yale, founded ECM Holdings, which is a major conglomerate, and travels extensively, and has founded private grant-giving foundation, and I think will bring a tremendous international perspective to this discussion. Kate Maver, Chief Executive of the National Trust for Scotland, and she's not immediately on my right.
Definitely not me.
I'm still going to stick with Kate, nevertheless. Kate Maver, Chief Executive of the National Trust for Scotland, who's been piloting the organisation through probably its most tricky period, possibly in its history, and if I may say so, brings a tremendously calm sense of confidence to the organisation at a very, very challenging time. Leslie Knox, on my right, currently chairman of the V&A at Dundee, and this has been her week, because yesterday she announced the choice of this stunning new design for a building which will house the V&A in Dundee, and if it, as I'm sure it will, comes to fruition, it will be a significant contribution, if you like, to the modern heritage of Scotland, and we may find ourselves debating what heritage actually means. And on my left, Adam Wilkerson, Director of the Edinburgh World Heritage, which is the charity that coordinates actions for the old and new towns of the Edinburgh World Heritage Site, and is actively involved both in promoting it and in interpreting it and in seeing that we don't put a foot wrong when we start doing things that might endanger Edinburgh World Heritage Site. So that's our panel. And I'm going to kick off by asking them to speak very briefly about the perspective that they bring to this subject. And my own feeling is that you could argue that this topic, how heritage can help win business for Scotland, is, in a way, counterintuitively, completely the wrong way around. Heritage, a lot of people might argue, is the thing that holds modern Scotland back. We are burdened by our heritage. It's almost a millstone around our neck. We are, don't shake your head at me already. I'm just provoking a discussion, for God's sake. And that in fact, a heritage is a burden to us rather than an aid. But Azeem, perhaps you would give us your view.
Thanks so much. First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank Carolyn and the Women's Trust and the National Trust for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak before you. It's a great honour for me. So how can heritage win business for Scotland? And there's two ways I believe that's possible. There's an indirect way and there's a direct way. Indirectly, heritage makes Scotland a fantastic place, not only to work, but also to live. Now, the global economy over the last 10 years has gone through profound changes through globalisation, what Henry Kissinger called the shifting of the centre of gravity from the west to the east. Now, Scotland is no longer an industrial powerhouse that we were in the past, with the heavy industries of steel, coal mining and shipbuilding. What we do have to concentrate now on is what they call selective creative industries, such as building a knowledge economy. And the kind of people that this kind of knowledge economy attracts in terms of our financial industries and the creative industries are usually the middle class type of people that are educated. And for us to continue to attract those kind of people, those people not only want a wonderful place to actually work in, but they want a wonderful place to actually live. They want culture and they want heritage. And I know this because I've lived in a number of countries in the developing world which are fantastic in terms of innovation, but they simply do not have this historical culture which they can actually boast. And this is something that Scotland, we can actually boast with pride. The second point I'd like to make in terms of the direct impact that heritage actually brings to Scotland, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Anne Holt JFK Roper Nation Branding Index. Well, basically, it's an annual survey, and it's the most extensive of its kind, in which they examine how different countries perceive each other. They do this by interviewing 20,000 people in 20 countries. Now, the first piece of good news from this index is that Scotland continuously punches above its weight on the global stage in terms of perception. For 8 countries, Scotland ranks in the top 10 for its tourism categories, and for 3 of these countries, Italy, France and Germany, we're in the top 3 for tourism. Now, tourism, according to a new report by Deloitte, actually brings in a lot more money to Scotland than we ever realised. Over 270,000 jobs in Scotland are directly relying on tourism. That is 10% of an entire Scottish workforce. Now, the reason why this figure is a lot higher than previous ones is because these are figures that are not just related to hotels or restaurants or golf courses, but they're related to industries that complement tourism, such as salmon and whisky, and the people that look after those golf courses. Now, the third point is that this tourism is actually expected to grow with a depreciating pound and the Olympics. In the year 2011 and 2012, when the Olympics are expected to come here, a 10% depreciation in the pound will bring an additional 1 million people to Scotland, who are expected to spend over £300 million whilst they are in Scotland. So I would argue that heritage not only brings business to Scotland directly, but also does indirectly through enhancing the quality of life of those people that are here.
Thank you very much, Azeem. Now, Leslie.
Well, first point, I absolutely agree with Azeem. Heritage is a magnet for people. People are critical to business. Heritage, I think, is also a halo for the country. And I say a halo because one of the critical bits for us as a business when you deal with people abroad is you need to convey a sense of scale, of purpose, of standing, and you need to convey a sense of continuity. Heritage is an incredible way of allowing us in Scotland to punch above our weight. It's an incredible way of giving that sense of continuity, which is incredibly important, particularly in the Far East, particularly in China, where they have a great culture of their own. They have a great belief in their own traditions, and they respect and they enjoy the same things when they deal with us. I think heritage is also an inspiration for business, and I don't just mean for the wonderful shortbread, whiskey, and all the things we know about. It's also, remember, in those great academic universities we have in Scotland, it is also about a tradition of learning. It's a heritage of the intellect, not just buildings, although they are the tangible expression of that. But those centres of learning are what pull in the sort of people that Azeem was talking about. They create a belief in centres of excellence, and they embody it. So heritage, I think, is a halo, a magnet for people, and an inspiration.
Very good. Kate.
Well, when I saw the title, I'm just reminding myself what it is, how heritage can help win business for Scotland. As a marketeer from the world of business, I instantly look for a unique selling proposition. What is it that makes Scotland unique and brings people here rather than somewhere else? And I think that if you're looking at attracting tourists or attracting business, it's the same thing. We've got to be different. We've got to be unique. And last week, when it was half-term, I travelled up to tick off another National Trust for Scotland property off my list. I haven't quite done them all yet. And this one was the Falls of Glomach, which is up in Kintail. And we went to the National Trust office and were fortunately lifted in the Land Ranger, whatever it's called, through the forest track and set on our way up a beautifully maintained footpath right up into an absolutely superb glen with snow on the tops, surrounded by stags in the rut, fully bellowing or roaring or whatever they do. And it was really a unique experience. I mean, I'm from Scotland. I'm 48 years old. I have never experienced this before, and it was an absolute joy. And that's the kind of unique experience that Scotland has in its natural heritage. I saw an eagle, I saw stags all around me, a fantastic experience. Down the road from Edinburgh, completely in contrast, I dragged my children to a tiny little business, which was a printing business, Robert Smale's printing business in Innerleithen, which is about an hour's drive from here. And there we have pristine, conserved as it was, the beautiful printing business with all its letter set and all its little different sizes of press. And my children were able to actually form some words, their own names in letter set printing, and print bookmarks to take home. Another unique experience, very, very memorable, very engaging for young children, and another example of something distinctive. And the last example I wanted to give was Magnus provocatively talked about looking backwards and heritage being the burden. We're very conscious of that at the National Trust for Scotland. We've got generations ahead to enthuse about heritage because our mission is to promote the heritage as much as to conserve it, and we look to future generations to continue this. And we have at Culloden Battlefield, that iconic battlefield where the last hand-to-hand combat was witnessed in this country. And how do you interpret a battlefield? It's just a field with all sorts of stories around it. And here we've harnessed technology to bring alive through the authentic words of the people who fought that battle and whose stories were captured very shortly afterwards. You can hear it in Gaelic, you can hear it in English, you can stand there and have it all brought alive to you as you walk the battlefield. And as you reach a particular place where something happened, into the headphones comes the story of whoever was standing there at that point. And that is a wonderful way of bringing things alive. And again, uniquely, we see that as a place to interpret conflict in the modern world as much as a story about a particular battle on a particular date. And those are three examples, I think, of where we can have a unique proposition that will be something that people can come and enjoy in Scotland that they wouldn't find anywhere else, something that's very essential.
Adam.
Wonderful, esteemed company, and delighted to be speaking amongst them all, and wonderful that everybody else has dealt with fact, because that leaves supposition to me. Now, all of this heritage, this extraordinary heritage the country has, is absolutely nothing. It is nothing without people, and the way people look at it, the way they perceive it, the way they value it, the way they valorize it. So who are these people? We've got 5 million of them in Scotland, 500,000 expats. That's 10% of the population is abroad already. That includes England, though. 4.8 million who call themselves Scots in Canada, 4.9 million call themselves Scots in the USA. There's a history, there's a common ground there already. And that mark is left on the language in the USA. A redneck, that comes from the Covenanters over there. A gringo, where does that come from? Green grow the rashes, oh. The Scottish soldiers singing away, the Mexicans picked this up, apparently, and gringo it was. And that brings us to Latin America. Latin America also has enormous Scots populations. That extraordinary term Scottish Brazilian, which makes me shudder, and is far better in Portuguese as Ecosés Brasileiro. Names like Carlos Drummond de Andrade, he's a contemporary poet, or Warwick Esteban Kerr, a scientist. Even the former president, past President Juan Perón, was a Scot in Argentina, and then in Chile, the likes of Thomas Cochrane, the 10th Earl of Dundonald of Coolross originally, and also the Marcos do Marano, the model for hornblower, a man who made his mark in Latin America and been booted out of the UK. Then you have 250,000 Russians of Scottish descent. You have 2.5 million Australians, 1 million in New Zealand. Malcolm X and Bob Marley, those fine Scots, they have Scottish descent. There is there a framework waiting to be activated through a shared knowledge, a shared history, and that common cultural ground. It's that commonality, that common understanding, which means there's an open door for business. And that heritage of people's knowledge, those memories and that communal memory, creates a way in which heritage can win business for Scotland.
Wow. Well, I'm not quite sure how to sort of top that, as it were, but possibly having listened to that in some admiration, I'd quite like to try and translate it into slightly more practical terms. That's all very well, all these wonderful images that you produced, whether it's the Falls of Glomac or Juan Perón, the well-known Scot. But how does that translate into tempting an investor, say, abroad, looking to where he might invest, and who is looking at other cities in the United Kingdom, all of whom have their heritage on offer as well? They could all say, we've got a bit of it as well. What would persuade them to come to a Scottish city rather than any other city? Leslie, why should they come to Dundee, for instance?
Well, we're lucky. We're just in the middle of, at the universities, recruiting a number of people. And one of the things, therefore, we've got is lots of people who are applying for jobs, and we're asking them, why do you want to come to Dundee? And the V&A is a big draw. There's no doubt about that. But there's also the sense I mentioned of excellence, that this is a historic place. And I think others have mentioned this. It's incredibly important to people from overseas that they come to somewhere that they can genuinely sell to their family. It's important if they're bringing a family that it has education, but it's also important that it is somewhere that their family will want to be. And culture is absolutely a critical part of that.
Azeem, I mean, you know, if you were to look in a hard-headed way at this proposition, surely somebody, you know, with a serious investment to make is not going to be swayed by airy-fairy notions of heritage. They're going to look at what is going to be the best place to do business with, and that's going to depend on a whole range of other things, modern communications, infrastructure, etc. Heritage surely must be a pretty minor factor in those decisions.
Not necessarily. Like I mentioned, I think a very important factor is the quality of life that they can actually offer to their employees. A few years back, it was about 3 years ago, I was asked to put together a very short proposal for the First Minister, Alex Salmond, in terms of how we can promote Scotland on the international stage. And I came out with 4 strategic objectives, which I articulated in my report. And one of them was to start capitalising on Scotland's heritage. Now, 90%, my research showed that 90% of people in the European Union had a very favourable opinion of Scotland, but 90% of them also had absolutely no idea where Scotland was or what Scotland is. You know, they would use the term England and Britain interchangeably. They would do like the Queen of England or the English Army in Iraq, but Scotland, they weren't really sure where does that fit in. So what I propose is that we look at Scotland's heritage, you know, and I'm not just referring here to the castles and the war memorials and so on. I'm talking about the intellectual capital. You know, Scotland, for a country of 5 million people, has continuously punched above its weight. In fact, no other country has contributed more to the progress of humanity than Scotland. And not many people are aware of this, including Scots. Apart from Switzerland, Scotland has actually had the most innovations and discoveries. You know, in terms of philosophy, Scotland gave the world David Hume, James Mill, Thomas Carlyle, and even a great thinker like Voltaire said that we look to Scotland for all our ideas on civilization. You know, when it comes to science, it was Scottish minds that gave the world the telephone, the television, penicillin, the steam engine, radar. These are inventions that have changed the course of humanity. You know, in terms of television and how people entertain themselves, and telephone, how people communicate. You know, these are very profound discoveries. When it comes to culture, Robert Burns, Robert Louis Stevenson, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and on top of that we have the world's largest cultural festival, the Edinburgh Festival. Now these are all very important facts. Now what I propose to the First Minister is that we have to start marketing Scotland on the global stage as the home of innovation. You know, that innovation, discovery and enterprise is actually within the DNA of the Scottish people, and history proves that. And this is the crux I suggested that we use to actually market Scotland on the global stage.
So Adam, it depends on how you define heritage.
It does, but listening to Azeem, you realise we've been sitting on our laurels dreadfully for the last sort of 50, 100 years or so. And I've got to say, come back to heritage just a second, but when I moved up here myself, I looked on the internet, moving to Edinburgh, quality of life, culture, And up came the Edinburgh Visitor website, and under culture, there was eating, drinking, and gay nightlife, and nothing else. And it wasn't until I got to the Standard Life website that I actually started to get into the quality of life issues and the innovation and those sorts of questions. But in terms of that definition of heritage and how that then fits into that, well, of course, these other things are aspects of the heritage of the city, although its culinary heritage perhaps isn't particularly famous. But we define heritage, I think, in the broadest terms possible. I talked about how buildings are nothing without their places, but also the communities as well. And those communities are a tremendous strength to Scotland. In other parts of Europe and also North America, community has effectively evaporated, it's dissolved, and different forms of community have come forward. And yet that community, which is so much a part of its buildings and so aware of its place, it doesn't call it heritage. It doesn't call it heritage, it calls it just its place, it calls it where it's from. But that communal memory and that heritage is tremendously strong and forms a very, very strong framework for anyone wanting to invest in this place. They will find there is a solid place with a solid society, and that's what you want, gives you the stability you need in a place.
And the National Trust, would it be able to offer to this prospective businessman some sort of sense of the country that he or she was coming to?
Yes, I think going back to that concept of being unique, I think what the National Trust for Scotland has, which other heritage organisations perhaps don't, is the combination not only of the cultural heritage, which is so very important, the built heritage, which is all the buildings, the castles and palaces that are associated with the Trust, but of course the natural heritage as well. And it's seeing everything in the round, so that it's the whole landscape, the whole building, the garden and the community around it that we value and that we put our efforts into conserving. So we do a lot with communities. We see things in the round. We don't see things in isolation. And I think that that's a very important part of conveying to people as they arrive in Scotland, that they become part of a whole and don't just go and sit in their own street and like the particular house they live in. For me, like Adam, I was also Googling where shall I go and live now, strangely, because although I'm from Glasgow, I hadn't ever lived in Scotland as an adult. 5 years ago, decided to move out of London, and what pulled me back was a very rootless world that I found myself living in, a world of globalization where people are all interchangeable, a mixing melting pot, which is London, which is very exciting. And at the point at which we moved up, which was the July of the bombings, we had, the week before we left, there was a big gathering of Londoners in Trafalgar Square to just bond, because we'd all been through such a trauma. And I did have, for the first time, a sense of place of being a Londoner, vestigial, just as I was leaving. But the thing that I really wanted for my own children was what I felt that I'd always had as a person adrift in London, was a sense of being a Scot. And although I hadn't lived here as an adult, I knew where I came from. I opened my mouth, people knew who I was and where I came from. And I wanted that for my children. And now that I'm living in Edinburgh, I find a lot of people living here who aren't from Scotland like I am. But they came to Edinburgh to university, for example, and they've stayed. And there's a big community in Edinburgh of people from south of the border. And they feel very strongly as well a sense of place, a sense of identity. I think that when you go out into the big wide world, and Azeem is a fantastic example of somebody who's just gone global, as so many Scots did before, you do it because you have your passport, you have your sense of I know who I am, I know where I come from, and that gives me confidence. And it's a springboard, and it's a springboard of, as you say, of feeling that the world is all out there for you to take, and innovation is in your genes. My family were engineers, they had mining equipment in every mine across the world. Just going out there and grasping it is part of our culture, and it's reflected in the objects that we look after and in the literary heritage that we conserve, and in very much in the trust is there to sell that story.
Excellent. Right. Well, this is a debate. This is for you to participate in, and we've got a question at the back there. Yes, please. Tell us who you are. Tell us who you are. Wait for the microphone to come to you.
Angus Mackay, long-time member of NTS, and looking at the title, I couldn't help thinking, does heritage itself need to adapt to the requirements of business?
Very good question. Leslie.
I think heritage is actually, if you think about it, a contemporary view of it. Heritage changes. So what we conserve, our ideas about heritage, are rooted in the present. So I think heritage is naturally something that changes. So I think it does reflect the present, and it should reflect the present. Should it reflect what business wants? Actually, business doesn't have a single view. Business has differing interests. The question is, can both come close enough to get the best out of that symbiotic relationship?
But heritage, you know, we think of it as something immutable. That's its point. Kate, what about, you know, there's been a great debate south of the border about the Disneyfication of heritage, and people don't like it if it gets a little too kind of touchy-feely.
Some people don't like it if it gets a bit touchy-feely. I think that what was a happy revelation to me when I came into this sector very recently, looking up the definition of the word conservation and how it's described in the principles of the National Trust for Scotland. Conservation is all about adapting to a changing environment. It's a recognition that if you put something in aspic, it will die because it's not going to be sustained by future generations. And if you've got the children of today spending their leisure time on an Xbox, which billion-pound industries have invested huge amounts in to try and engage and excite them, they are not going to stand and read a whole side of A4 label and in front of a glass cabinet. That just won't work for them. So what you have to do is distinguish between dumbing down, which means that you give them 3 words because you know they're not going to read any more than that, and thinking about how else can you engage them with this story other than making them stand there and read through it. And we've put a lot of time and effort into our new interpretation of Robert Burns. The museum with over 1,000 artefacts commemorating Burns opens at the end of this month, and our panel that's been advising us on how to interpret the museum is the primary school at Alloway and the secondary school from the south side of Glasgow, which has a very good ethnic mix of young people, just so that we're making sure that the next generation who are going to carry on this tradition, who may not be going to Burns suppers as we do now, well, hopefully they will, but they will be looking ahead to see what engages them, what enthuses them, but remembering that our principles at the Trust are about authentic interpretation of the real stories and the real heritage of Scotland. So we're in no sense are we dumbing down, we're just adapting how we get across the message and how we inspire and enthuse people. And the museum is also divided into things that will appeal to a 7-year-old and things that will appeal to a Burns scholar who wants to come and find out something he doesn't already know about Burns. We have the whole spectrum. It's all in there. I don't think it's dumbing down. I think it's engaging more people.
Just wait for the mic. And introduce yourself, Robin.
Robin Harper, just on to NTS Council and about to retire from the Parliament. Only 21 weeks to go. Sorry. First, an apology, Magnus. When somebody's clearly setting up an antithesis, your first statement was clearly one you were going to disagree with. I also disagreed with it. That's why I was shaking my head. And I hope you noticed my enthusiastic nodding to your...
Yes, well, go on, get to the point, Robin. What's your question?
Right. The question is this. Adam quite correctly reminded us of the huge number of people all over the world that have that are related to Scotland in one way or another through lineage. And Azeem also reflected on the lack of knowledge of Scotland in Europe. But in this situation that we're in at the moment, we should be surely appealing to local staycationists, to people who live in England, who are coming up to Scotland, and to get them not just onto the hills, but into our historic heritage, and to Europe, where when you think of the links that we have with Europe in terms of the history of the development of art and architecture and design of the environment in Scotland, is absolutely immense, going back centuries. So the question really is, to get people from Europe, what should we be doing?
Azeem,
I think much of it really just comes down to marketing. It really comes down to very clever marketing. And like I said, and as Adam mentioned, you know, there's a very large population globally that that has roots in Scotland. You know, last year I had the great honour, I was awarded the St Andrews Society Distinguished Citizens Award, and for the Scot who's done the most to promote Scotland internationally. The year before me, it was awarded to Arnie Duncan, who's President Obama's Secretary of Education. Now, he's never been to Scotland, but there, the St Andrews Society definition of Scotland, of somebody being a Scot, is either you're Scottish by birth, Scottish by heritage, or you are Scottish simply by inclination. This is their definition. So you could visit Scotland and be astounded by the castles and everything else and say, well, look, I actually feel Scottish. And within their definition, you're actually a Scot. You know, we have to tap into a lot of these resources that we have abroad. In the United States, and each state has a St Andrews Society in the various states, who are doing an immense job in terms of promoting Scotland. And I remember during the Al-Megrahi situation in the US, you know, when much of the media picked up on this, and there was a lot of negativity in the press about Scotland. You know, the St Andrews Society were able to tap into a lot of their sources. They have over 70 congressmen and senators in the Scottish American caucus, who many of them have never been to Scotland but have Scottish heritage. But they're able to tap into that kind of resource, and this is what we have to do. We have to use clever marketing to tap into a lot of the people who themselves are not actually aware that they have Scottish heritage, but there's literally millions and millions of them all over the globe. So I think a clever combination of marketing and tapping into this untapped resource will bring a lot of fruitful progress.
And Adam, do you think that it's a question of sort of promoting this Scottish heritage to a particular area, to concentrate on England and Europe, or is this a global challenge?
I think it's all about beer, Magnus. Guinness. The Guinness adverts from the last 20 years have focused on the culture of that country through 486 mils, where it is, which you find in a pint. And that's probably done more for tourist promotion in Ireland than any other efforts. That's a question of extraordinary branding and extraordinary marketing. Of course, we can market ourselves abroad in a different way. We have strength which we play to as well. Now, modern Scottish government, I think, is in some ways afraid of playing to those strengths, of playing to tartan and shortbread. And yet that's what people come here for. They come here for the Highlands, they come up here to Edinburgh, they'll do the circuit of the Highlands, stay in Edinburgh, and then disappear again. And it's how you break them out of that, how do you get them out of the southwest to see the delights of the southwest, an extraordinary part of the country. How do you get those staycationers not to come during the festival, but come outside the festival and stay in the city at a time when the hotels really need them to stay. And so it's about using the marketing wisely and intelligently, rather than just saying, come to Scotland. Come to Scotland at this time because of this. And then actually capitalising on those assets rather than being slightly embarrassed about them.
My question follows on from an earlier question, and I'd like, if I may, to preempt it with some context. Up until July this year, I'm Elizabeth Lister. I was Director of Student Recruitment and Admissions at the University of Edinburgh. So my business was very much about attracting students to Edinburgh and to the university. In April this year, I started on a 2-year programme with the Scottish Tourist Guide Association to become a Blue Badge Guide. So I'm going completely off in another direction. I gave up working at the university in July. And so it seems to me that there are 2 sets of organisations in Scotland. One set of organisations has expertise in the heritage and culture, the National Trust, Historic Scotland, Scottish Tourist Guide Association, to name but 3. And then we have business. And my question to the panel is, how best do you think we can bring these 2 sectors together to help win business for Scotland?
That's good. That's a very good question. Azeem, would you like to look at?
Well, in my own personal experience in dealing with some of these organisations in terms of promoting Scotland, in terms of attracting business from abroad, they simply don't, many of them themselves are simply not aware of Scottish heritage, which is grossly unfortunate. So I think there is, as you said, there is a great area for collaboration between them. And as Adam said, it really just comes down to clever marketing. It comes down to clever marketing and branding yourself as being this hub of innovation. You know, it was only back in the 80s when we had Silicon Glen. We had some of the largest semiconductor and IT companies in the world that were based here in Scotland. You know, from Motorola to Sun Microsystems, etc. You know, we have to try to capitalise on this kind of heritage that we have, even the most recent heritage, to try to attract a lot of those kind of businesses to come back. But it really just comes down to clever marketing and branding. A lot of other countries in the world are trying to do a similar kind of thing. I was just in Abu Dhabi literally just a couple of weeks ago, where I was there with the US State Department, and they're launching a national innovation strategy. And there's only 2 countries in the world that have actually got an official national innovation strategy, and that is, one of them is Singapore, and now is Abu Dhabi. Now we in Scotland, and I wrote to Jim Mather straight after this meeting that I had, and say Scotland has to create something similar. You know, we have to create a national innovation strategy, and a lot of it comes down to clever branding and marketing, and trying to capitalise on the heritage that we have, on the quality of life that we can offer, and the cultural significance that Scotland has.
Leslie, put that into a local context, Dundee, for instance. How do you combine those 2 things? The promotion of business, on the one hand, extremely important in Dundee with its sort of innovative technology, but at the same time branding it as, you know, a city of discovery, etc. But nevertheless, those are quite old-fashioned. That ship sitting there is quite a sort of old-fashioned symbol. How do you bring those things together?
Well, 10% of the world games market is based in Dundee. And what's that about? That's about actually 2 great universities developing centres of excellence, which pulls in people from around the world. I think the issue is about keeping that pressure up on a sustained basis. So not coming and going, and, you know, for one parliament something is in the forefront and then it just disappears and something else. It's about making some of these things priorities and sticking to them long enough to get some traction. The Scottish whisky industry, known around the world, malt whisky tends to be known as Scotch. Now, it may be made in Japan, which is a bit of a blow for all of us. In Europe, actually, malt whisky was almost unheard of. Last 15 years, it's been a growing market in France and Germany. One of our greatest products, which actually for a very long time, that wasn't a market that drank it. Now, it's a substantial growing market. So it's about sustained effort, which is what any business knows. You absolutely have to have a plan and you have to keep putting the effort in. So I think it's about sustained effort.
Okay, next question. Okay, one in the middle here and one from the further back, I thought.
Hi, my name's Claire MacLeod. I'm from a company called Intermezzo. And I want to know whether National Trust Scotland are willing to engage with companies that are developing technologies and using new technology in social media. I know a lot of that's quite, a lot of the National Trust or the public bodies are not too keen to do that. But there are a lot of companies out there who are willing to help and often to do things for free, businesses already in Scotland, to help globally promote places like the National Trust. So I was wondering, you know, do you look for those companies who will help you and who will help you to grow and to reach a global market? And maybe there are businesses in Scotland that will help you do that without, you know, in a different... But it's whether the National Trust is keen to look at those type of companies.
I mean, is that one of the sort of challenges that you face, is, Kate, on the National Trust, how you actually build those bridges to a wider audience and a wider market?
I think it's the challenge for any organisation to increase the number of people that it engages with and the number of people that can sign up as members. And we obviously have a membership strategy, because that is how we define our customer base, if you like. It's the lifeblood of the trust. It's a quarter of our income is from members. We have 310,000 at the moment, and it's been going up consistently over the last 10, 20 years. It's an upward curve, and we've set ourselves greater targets. And then, as with any organisation, you say, where are you going to get the next 100,000? And you look around you and say, are they going to be from overseas, or have we still got more to go, more low-hanging fruit, perhaps in the northeast of England, or perhaps going into different segments of Scottish society that we currently aren't in? So we'll be constantly reviewing it in terms of our growth strategy. Where are we going to put our marketing effort to expand our membership and to expand the number of visitors? Now, when it comes to getting people to come, I feel that that's very best done by ourselves in partnership with people like Visit Scotland, who have the resources to actually go out and market Scotland to the wider world. And we don't want to be just marketing one waterfall up in Kintail. You want to market the whole of the northwest of Scotland, or you want to market all the attractions in one particular region. And I think that's best done jointly, attracting people into Scotland in the first place. Then once they're here, then we can attract them by making sure our marketing locally is as good as it can be. But in answer to your question, yes, we are always interested in any expertise from outside, any suggestions. We've actually got a lot of support from volunteers who come in and do. We have a volunteer who does nothing but put us on Twitter. So he twitters away or tweets away quietly in the corner of the room, and that is not a strategy, that's a tactic, I appreciate, but we would very much welcome a visit from your firm at any time to just talk about all the different things we could and should be doing within the context of where we want to go strategically. Yes, please.
There are a lot of businesses who generally do want to help, not from a making money angle, but that they've got those ideas and they really want to help.
Adam, how does a place like the city of Edinburgh, which is preserved not least by your organisation because it has an image, an architectural image in particular, a historical image,
Homecoming Scotland from the Scottish perspective. I was in the United States when much of the promotion was being done, and I remember going to a couple of events where I met people, and as soon as they heard my accent, they told me, yeah, we're going to Scotland for the homecoming. So and this was at least 3 times that happened. So from that perspective, people were aware of homecoming, and they did want to participate in it, and they had things planned out. We're going to go to St Andrews for the golf, and we're going to do this. I remember having those conversations. From that perspective, it did resonate, and it did penetrate a lot of the kind of target market in the United States.
I wonder if, by extension, whether the collapse of Scotland's 2 banks has damaged its heritage, one of which is a characteristic of being a sort of canny, good, sound nation with sort of good business sense, and suddenly you have the collapse of 2 major banks. Do you think that has actually damaged its image?
Well, I can only speak from the US perspective, with which I'm most familiar with, and in reality, I don't think many people are even aware of the 2 banks in Scotland that had trouble, simply because much larger institutions in the US were collapsing on a much more regular kind of basis, and I think that was in the forefront of their mind rather than what's happening here in Scotland.
Yeah.
I have a question that I've been asked to ask on behalf of Dick Balharry, who was who's the former chairman of the previous chairman of the National Trust for Scotland, who recently handed over at the AGM to Sir Kenneth Carman. And you must forgive me if I read this, but he tasked me specifically on the phone this morning to write it down and read it out as he'd asked it. So I'm going to do as I was told.
Sounds kind of threatening.
So it is this. Sustainability has come into our language in common usage since 1983, when it was used comprehensively in the World Conservation Strategy. Can the panel please name one economic activity in Scotland that is sustainable?
I'll go for it.
Azeem.
You might choose your own.
It depends, I think, how you define sustainability. You know, I would argue the tourist industry is completely sustainable. It brings in a huge amount of revenue. As I mentioned, you know, 10% of our workforce is relying on tourism. And, you know, what do we actually have to do apart from just promote what's already in existence, you know, to attract that tourism? So I can certainly think of a few other industries that are sustainable. You know, and once again, many people aren't aware of this, but Scotland is actually a world leader in aqua farming. You know, that's a completely sustainable industry right here in Scotland. You know.
Is it?
Tourism, I'm afraid, is the obvious one.
Kate?
Tourism depending on the tourist attraction. I've just been presiding over the putting up of a new museum in Alloway to commemorate Robert Burns. And I know, because I saw them go in, that the heating system comes through big pipes that are in the ground, and I'm not quite sure of the science of it, but I do know that it will be self-sufficient in terms of energy generation, and it's got its solar panels on the roof and its solar tubes that mean that lights go into the kitchen without having to switch anything on. And I think it's a mindset that if you set about anything new, anything that you develop, or any new initiative that you have on your triple bottom line or whatever, you have a commitment from the outset to do everything you can with whatever technology you have to hand to ensure that you are building sustainability into every activity. I can't name one specific one, but I do know that our most recent projects, being the Culloden and Burns Visitor Centres, are both built on that basis and have all sorts of things built into them that make them sustainable.
Last and therefore lucky on this one. I'm going to do something very mundane, which is the building maintenance industry. It's an activity which carries on all year round and throughout the economic cycle. It's economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. Those are the three main strands of sustainability. It's socially sustainable because you're supporting local businesses. It's usually the local man with a van who comes around, empties out your gutters, repoints your walls. It's environmentally sustainable because it doesn't lead to the loss of buildings over time. It actually keeps those buildings there, so the embodied energy remains. It's economically sustainable because it's a small business which is required throughout the year. It doesn't come and go. It's actually needed. And you put the money into the local economy as well. So you get the local multiplier effect. You're buying your supplies from local places. You're a major national contractor buying from around the world, shipping in stone from Japan or China. You're getting your materials locally. So I think that's a most sustainable industry, small scale, hugely effective, and tremendously important to keeping our buildings upright.
If I can just add, if you could tell Dick that the chairman would like to add that Scotland is actually at the forefront and indeed the cutting edge of an industry which is almost by definition sustainable, which is renewable energy. Yeah. And so across the board, from wind and wave and tidal, to say nothing of carbon capture and all the rest of it, Scotland is actually really is leading on all of those things. So you can tell him that.
I did tell him that one this morning.
Did you?
I didn't know about the aquafarm.
Right. We've got about 5 minutes more, so snappy questions.
My name is David Cox. I work in the Scotch whisky business. I market a brand of single malt called the Macallan. In the last 10 years, our business has literally exploded in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think our product is really celebrated for the long traditions that we draw on. We are effectively in the slow-moving consumer goods business rather than the fast-moving consumer goods business. I just wonder whether the panel feels there is potentially a dichotomy in the marketing of Scotland as an innovative place to do business that generates innovative businesses, as against the business that I'm in, which draws very heavily on heritage, which I find in my travels around the world is something that people very much expect of Scotland, want of Scotland, and expect to find when they come here.
That's a very, very good question, which sort of brings us back to the heart of how you bring those two apparently contradictory things together. Kate?
Well, I think we've covered it quite a few times already this evening in seeing it's how you combine the sense of honouring the past with the spirit of innovation and going out and being pioneering. We should always be pioneering. I think a comment that Leslie made earlier on was one that reminded me of the dichotomy that I think between the Scots who do go out and change the world and can't wait to be in different countries talking up their home country, and then a large body of Scots who'll sit at home and find fault with everything and can't wait to criticise the homecoming because it wasn't as good as it should have been. And there definitely is, and I mean, books have been written on the subject about the Scottish cringe and the sense of, you know, don't put your head above the parapet because everybody loves to shoot you down straight away. And I find that quite an interesting dichotomy within the country, because there are pockets of real excellence, as we've described in Scotland. You know, I think of the Department of Informatics up at Edinburgh University, where there is it's an elitist hub where the top people from all around the world are coming to be part of it because it's really at the forefront. But you never hear any mention of it in the general press. And Magdalene's story, you've probably done a huge article on it that I haven't read. But I do think that we take great merriment from finding out all the faults of things going on in Scotland and don't champion the things that really are going on. So I think we have to ask ourselves, it's all very well saying we have had the inventor of the telephone and the inventor of penicillin and everything, but who are the current people that we should be celebrating? And we should be celebrating them and making more of them and putting our efforts into marketing our current people and our current centres of excellence as much as looking back, and perhaps combining the two as you're so successfully doing with the Macallan. I'm sure all your marketing and business methods are absolutely state of the art. Of course, combined with your, I mean, I went around the Talister distillery 2 weeks ago and they were peddling heritage to the nth degree, but it works, you know, and they were shifting the bottles and it was a lovely experience. And I think that it is that clever combining of the two, but I think we are complacent at our peril about how innovative we really are.
By the way, I think Kate has just coined the slogan for the next brand of Macallans, that you malt whiskey, the spirit of innovation. Very, very good title. Azeem, what about what you?
Yeah, I don't think there's a dichotomy at all. I've been to places in the world in which they've been at the absolute cutting edge of innovation, but simply because they don't have this culture and this heritage behind them, you know, they're not necessarily the most attractive of places. And the example that comes to the forefront of my mind is the King Abdulaziz University in Saudi Arabia. You know, they spent over $2 billion trying to build this new technological university. But one of the things that they don't have is just simply the heritage. And I asked my supervisor when I was at Cambridge, you know, why doesn't he move to the United States, you know, where he can get a 6-figure salary and, you know, very little workload. And he said, Azeem, he goes, people will always come to Cambridge because they're interested in ideas rather than driving a big car. You know, we have a very huge, strong heritage. Some of the greatest thinkers in history have come from Scotland, and we have to try to capitalise on this. And I would say just with your particular product, you know, over the next few decades, we're going to see a very large rise in the middle classes throughout the globe. Most countries in the world have a small percentage of people that are richer than most, and then a percentage that are poorer than most. Then there's a bulge in the middle. The middle class is usually defined as those that have 1/3 of their income as disposable income. There's going to be a huge rise in the middle class, huge markets opening up for products like your whiskey for these new markets. And it all comes down to, once again, clever branding and marketing before we can make those kind of products attractive to those people.
Excellent. Well, that, I'm afraid, is all we've got time for. But I see that Sir Kenneth Calman has slipped in at the back since we began talking. And perhaps, Sir Kenneth, you can just give us a postscript rather than an introduction.
Well, thanks, Marcus. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a lot easier to get from Glasgow Airport into town than Edinburgh Airport. It was approximately 45 minutes getting out of the airport tonight, so my apologies. And a welcome here to this very important meeting for us as we develop the Queen's Heritage Circle. Can I thank the sponsors for this evening, and indeed I'm sure that's happened before, but may I also thank the Royal Society of Edinburgh for the room. I've enjoyed the debate. I just missed the first sort of 10 minutes or so, but a number of things did strike me. First of all, the vision that we have for the National Trust is one which is for everyone to enjoy and embrace, and that includes the business community, and we must remember that all the time. Kate's point earlier about the National Trust being holistic, I think, is also very important. It's not just buildings, it's not just castles, but it does contain some of the most glorious countryside in Scotland, if not the world, with a heritage which is really quite enormous. The European links, I think, are enormously strong in Scotland. Most of medicine came from Holland, most of the big science came from Germany, and we have huge links with a range of other European countries. We could use that. And one of the things that struck me, and I'm 5 weeks into the job, so I'm learning just a bit. One of the things that has struck me going around the properties, and I was in Five-Year Castle a couple of days ago, is the enormous international composition of the properties. They are not just Scotland, but the paintings are from Italy, and the pottery is from Delft, and the furniture's from England. We actually have a huge international presence in Scotland. It's not little Scotland, it's very big Scotland as an international presence. And if you take the Far Eastern market, the Indian market, it's huge what we have in the properties I've seen in the last few weeks. And I hope we could develop that too. If you've got businesses, if you've got links with these countries, if they're coming to Scotland, the National Trust is the place to bring them to see where the links are. And I think that's pretty important. There are lots of ways in which I think business can help and develop. And again, I've enjoyed the debate. That interaction between heritage and business was, I think, an important part of it. But there were 5 things that dawned on me as you were talking. One is energy. We have lots of remarkable places within the Trust where energy of a renewable sort can be developed. From streams, rivers, lochs, waves, wind, whatever. There is a business opportunity there to see how things might develop. Secondly, the digital media. We have world leaders in Dundee in this kind of area. And indeed, as I was watching yesterday from the art school in Glasgow, astonishing range of techniques which we can and could use. We can and you can use National Trust properties to support your business in music, the arts, and poetry, and theatre. It's all there. There are places where you can use to support your business. I've been telling Kate and others about the Green Gym recently. The Green Gym is for you and your companies to come into National Trust properties, perhaps pay a small fee, 10,000 is the normal going rate, and spend 2 days digging ditches, putting up fences, cutting down rhododendrons, and having a great time. It's called bonding sometimes. But there are ways, I think, in which you can use the properties in a very productive way. And that includes those with disabilities, those with mental health problems, etc. So there are ways we can do that. And the last thing, which did cross my mind as you were speaking, relates to the educational side. Huge educational opportunities of all sorts for businesses and indeed for the universities, I think, may not have capitalised on just what there is there. So this is a new venture for us, this Weems Heritage Circle. I'm delighted we're having it. There are lots of interesting things coming up over the next few months. I will be writing to you personally after this meeting just to bring you up to date with things. But on your behalf, can I thank the panel, particularly the chairman, for bringing it all together. And I hope you've enjoyed the evening and will continue to support the National Trust for Scotland. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely, I've got to run too.
All this, World Heritage